The sun beat mercilessly against Ruth Vance's parched lips as she fell to her knees beside the withered creek bed, her trembling fingers clawing at the cracked earth in desperation. 6 weeks without rain had transformed the once thriving landscape of West Texas into a barren wasteland. And at 22, Ruth was beginning to accept that her dream of creating a life for herself might end right here in this God-forsaken terrain outside Bandera, Texas, in the summer of 1873. Yancey Thornton spotted the woman from nearly half a mile away, her faded blue dress a stark contrast against the dusty brown landscape. At 30 years old, he'd seen his share of death in these parts: men, women, cattle, and hope itself dying under the relentless Texas sun, but something about the solitary figure made him redirect his exhausted palomino from their intended path toward the settlement. "Madam," he called out, his voice rough from days of riding through dust clouds. "You all right there?" Ruth startled, scrambling backward with the wariness of someone who'd learned the hard way that strangers weren't always saviors. Her reddish-brown hair hung in limp strands around a face that might have been pretty before desperation had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones. "I'm fine," she lied, pride forcing strength into her voice even as her body swayed from dehydration. Yancey dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life on horseback. His tall frame cast a long shadow as he approached, hat in hand, revealing sun-bleached blonde hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. "No disrespect intended, madam, but you don't look fine." He reached for the canteen hanging from his saddle and offered it without hesitation. "Water's more precious than gold these days, but I reckon you need this more than I do right now." Ruth's eyes locked on the canteen, her throat convulsing with need, but her hands remained stubbornly at her sides. "I can't take your water, mister, not out here." A half-smile crossed Yancey's weathered face. "Name's Yancey Thornton, and I ain't offering charity, just common decency. Got a spring fed well on my ranch about 4 miles north that ain't dried up yet." He extended the canteen further. "Take it, please." The please undid her. Ruth reached for the canteen with trembling hands, taking a small, measured sip as tears threatened to spill down her dirt-streaked face. "Ruth Vance," she managed after swallowing the life-giving liquid. "I had a homestead about 2 miles east." "Had?" Yancey nodded, understanding immediately what she wasn't saying. The drought had claimed countless small farms already, forcing families to abandon everything they'd built. "You heading somewhere particular, Miss Vance?" he asked, noting she carried nothing but a small leather pouch tied to her belt. "Bandera," she replied, handing back his canteen with reluctance. "Heard they might be hiring at the hotel." Yancey frowned, knowing the grim reality better than most. Towns overrun with folks in the same situation. Hotels not hiring owner's wife just took in her sister and 3 cousins from a failed farm in Careville. He hesitated, then added, "I've got room in my cabin. It's not much, but there's water and food. You could rest up before moving on." Ruth's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She'd heard tales of women in desperate situations falling prey to men with unsavory intentions. "That's mighty generous for a stranger. My ma would haunt me something fierce if I left a lady alone out here to die," Yancey replied simply. "You can have the cabin. I'll bunk in the barn till you decide what's next." Something in his direct gaze convinced Ruth he spoke truthfully. Or perhaps it was simply that her alternatives had narrowed to this one chance at survival. "I can work," she said firmly. "I'm not looking for charity." Yancey nodded, respecting the pride that kept her spine straight despite everything. "Got no shortage of work needing doing. Drought's hard on everyone." He reached for his horse's reins. "Can you ride? My boy here can carry us both to the ranch if you're willing." Ruth hesitated only briefly before nodding. She'd been raised on a horse farm in Missouri before her parents died of fever 3 years ago, leaving her to make her own way in the world. Yancey helped her onto the Palomino before swinging up behind her, maintaining a respectful distance as they set off across the parched landscape. Ruth sat stiffly at first, uncomfortable with the proximity to a man she'd just met, but as exhaustion overtook her, she found herself leaning back against his solid chest. "Rest if you need to, Miss Vance," Yancey said quietly. "I'll see you safe." Against her better judgment, Ruth closed her eyes, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, and the secure circle of Yancey's arms keeping her from falling. The 4-mile journey passed in a haze of heat and dust before Yancey's voice roused her from her half-conscious state. "We're here." Ruth opened her eyes to see a modest but well-maintained ranch spread out before them. A sturdy log cabin stood near a large barn, with corrals holding a handful of horses that looked thinner than they should have been, but were alive, a miracle in itself during these times. Beyond the immediate buildings lay pastures where small clusters of cattle grazed on what little vegetation remained. At the center of it all stood a large windmill, its blades turning lazily in the hot breeze. "You have water," Ruth whispered, unable to hide her amazement. "Underground spring," Yancey confirmed as he helped her dismount. "Goes deep enough that the drought hasn't reached it yet. It's why I haven't had to sell off as much of my herd as some others." He nodded toward the cattle. "Lost about half already, though." Ruth stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground, her legs unsteady after the ride and days of insufficient food and water. Yancey's hand shot out to steady her, his touch gentle but quickly withdrawn once she was stable. "Let's get you inside," he said, leading her toward the cabin. "Sun's fierce today." The interior of the cabin was simple but clean, with a main room containing a wooden table, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and a few shelves holding essential supplies. A doorway led to what Ruth assumed was a bedroom, and she tensed slightly until Yancey spoke. "That's where you'll sleep," he said, gesturing to the bedroom. "I've got a cot in the barn I use during calving season." He moved to the stove where a large pot sat. "Got some beans left from breakfast. Not fancy, but it'll put strength back in you." Ruth sank into one of the chairs, fighting the urge to weep at this unexpected kindness. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Thornton." "Yancey," he corrected, ladling beans into a tin plate. "And there's no need for thanks. Anyone would do the same, but they both knew that wasn't true. Not in these desperate times when most people were focused solely on their own survival." Ruth ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour the food despite her hunger. Yancey busied himself gathering supplies, giving her space and dignity while she ate. "I meant what I said about working," she said when she'd finished. "I can cook, clean, mend. I grew up around horses too." Yancey nodded, considering. "Got a vegetable garden out back that's barely hanging on. Could use tending, and the horses always need care." He paused. "But you need to rest first. Get your strength back." Ruth wanted to argue but found her eyelids growing heavy, her body demanding the rest he suggested. Yancey seemed to notice, for he gently took the empty plate from her hands. "Sleep, Miss Vance. Everything else can wait." Too exhausted to resist, Ruth allowed him to guide her to the bedroom where a simple but clean bed awaited. The moment her head touched the pillow, sleep claimed her completely. When Ruth awakened, golden evening light was filtering through the small window. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings triggering a flash of panic before memory returned. She'd been found by a cowboy, Yancey Thornton, and brought to his ranch. The smell of coffee drew her from the bedroom. She found Yancey at the stove, his back to her as he worked. "Hope I didn't sleep too long," she said, causing him to turn. "Not at all. Needed it, I'd say." He gestured to the table where a plate of cornbread and a cup of coffee waited. "It's not much, but it'll help." "It's more than I've had in days," Ruth replied honestly, taking a seat. "Thank you." Yancey joined her at the table with his own coffee. "If you don't mind my asking, what happened to your homestead?" Ruth's fingers tightened around her cup. "My husband died last winter, pneumonia. I tried to keep the place going, but when the drought hit..." She shook her head. "The well dried up 3 weeks ago. Crops failed. I held on as long as I could." Yancey's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Vance." "Miss Vance," she corrected quietly. "It wasn't a proper marriage. Daniel and I were traveling west together. He got sick before we could find a preacher." The admission cost her, but she wouldn't start this new chapter with a lie, no matter how society might judge her. If Yancey was shocked or disapproving, he didn't show it. "Life out here doesn't always follow the neat patterns folks back east expect," was all he said. Ruth felt tears threatening again at his simple acceptance. Most people wouldn't be so understanding. "Most people haven't lived long enough on the frontier to know judgment is a luxury few can afford." He rose from the table, tactfully giving her a moment to compose herself. "There's soap and water in the basin if you'd like to freshen up. I need to check on the cattle before dark." After he'd gone, Ruth allowed herself to truly look around the cabin. It was a man's home, functional rather than decorative, but clean and well organized. A bookshelf in the corner held a surprising number of volumes: poetry, history, and practical guides to ranching and farming. Not the collection of a simple cowhand, but of a man with depths beyond his rugged exterior. Ruth washed her face and hands, combed her hair with her fingers, and straightened her dress as best she could. When Yancey returned, she was sitting on the small porch, watching the sun set over the distant hills. "It's beautiful here," she said as he approached. "Despite everything." Yancey leaned against the porch railing. "That's what keeps most of us going, beauty in the midst of hardship." He cleared his throat. "I brought you something." He held out a bundle of fabric. "Found these in a trunk. Belonged to my sister before she married and moved to San Antonio. Might fit you better than what you're wearing." Ruth accepted the simple dresses with genuine gratitude. "Your kindness overwhelms me, Mr. Th. Yancey." "Just being neighborly," he replied, though they both knew it was far more than that. "Get some more rest. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I can show you around the place." The next morning dawned marginally cooler, a small mercy as Ruth stepped outside wearing one of the dresses Yancey had given her. It was a simple blue calico, a bit loose but clean and whole, unlike her own threadbare garment. She found Yancey already at work, leading a tired-looking bay horse from the corral to the water trough. He looked up as she approached, his expression momentarily unguarded as he took in her transformed appearance. "Morning," he said, quickly looking back to the horse. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Ruth admitted. "What can I do to help today?" Yancey seemed surprised by her eagerness to work. "You sure you're ready? No rush." "I've never been one to sit idle," she replied firmly, "and I don't intend to start now." A smile tugged at his mouth. "All right, then." "Garden needs watering and weeding. What's left of it, anyway. Tools are in the shed beside it." Ruth spent the morning carefully tending to the struggling vegetables, carrying precious water from the well in buckets to nourish the withering plants. Despite the drought, Yancey had managed to keep a small patch of beans, squash, and tomatoes a live testament to his determination and the precious water source beneath his land. By midday, sweat soaked through her borrowed dress, but Ruth felt more alive than she had in weeks. There was purpose in her movements, hope in the simple act of nurturing plants that might yet bear fruit. Yancey found her there, kneeling in the dirt, her face flushed from exertion. "You've done more with that garden in one morning than I managed in a week," he observed, offering her a dipper of water from the bucket he carried. Ruth drank gratefully. "My mother taught me about growing things. Said a woman who could coax food from the earth would never truly starve." "Wise woman," Yancey replied, his gray eyes studying her with new respect. "You should come in for a bit, rest during the worst of the heat." Inside the relative coolness of the cabin, Ruth insisted on preparing their midday meal, using some of the beans she'd harvested along with cornmeal to make a simple but filling dish. They ate in companionable silence, both accustomed to solitude yet finding the shared meal unexpectedly pleasant. "How long have you been here?" Ruth asked as they finished eating. "5 years," Yancey replied. "Came west after the war, worked as a ranch hand until I saved enough to buy this place." He didn't specify which side he'd fought on, and Ruth didn't ask. Those divisions seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of nature's indifferent cruelty. "You've done well for yourself," she observed. "Most men would have lost everything in this drought." "Been close a few times," he admitted. "But I'm stubborn, and lucky with that spring." He hesitated, then added, "I should tell you, though, if this dry spell doesn't break soon, even my luck might run out. Don't want you thinking this arrangement is permanent if I end up having to sell." Ruth appreciated his honesty. "I've learned not to count on permanence, Mr. Thornton. But I'm grateful for the respite, however long it lasts." The days fell into a rhythm as July gave way to August. Ruth took charge of the household and garden, finding satisfaction in bringing order and care to Yancey's bachelor existence. He, in turn, tended the livestock and made regular trips to check on neighboring ranches, often returning with grim reports of abandoned homesteads and failing wells. Despite the harsh realities around them, a tentative friendship bloomed between Ruth and Yancey. She discovered his quiet intelligence during evening conversations, when he would sometimes read aloud from one of his books. He learned of her childhood in Missouri, her dreams of someday having a place of her own again, and her determination to stand on her own 2 feet despite society's expectations of women. "Why did you never marry?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching distant heat lightning illuminate the horizon. Yancey was silent so long Ruth thought he might not answer. "Was engaged once," he finally said. "Before the war. She married someone else while I was away. Can't blame her, wasn't sure I'd come back." He shrugged. "After that, just never seemed to be the right time or place." Ruth nodded, understanding all too well how life's circumstances could redirect one's path. "Daniel wasn't my first love either," she admitted. "But he was kind and we shared a dream of making our way west." She smiled sadly. "He used to say Texas was the place where people could reinvent themselves." "Was he right?" Yancey asked softly. Ruth considered this. "I'm still finding out, I suppose." As August progressed, the drought tightened its grip on the region. Yancey was forced to sell more of his cattle, the herd dwindling to just enough breeding stock to rebuild if the rains ever returned. The spring fed well, while still producing, yielded less each day, forcing them to ration water with increasing strictness. Through it all, Ruth remained, her initial hesitation about staying with a man she barely knew giving way to trust built through shared hardship. She'd offered to leave for Bandera several times, but Yancey always shook his head. "No sense in both of us struggling separately when we can get by together," he'd say, his practical tone belying the concern in his eyes. Besides, the gardens never looked better. The truth, which neither acknowledged aloud, was that they'd grown to depend on each other in ways that went beyond mere survival. Ruth found herself watching for Yancey's return whenever he rode out, her heart lightening at the sight of him approaching. And Yancey, who'd lived contentedly alone for years, discovered that his cabin felt empty during the hours Ruth spent tending to the garden or visiting the elderly widow who lived on the neighboring property. It was during one of these visits that tragedy struck. Ruth had walked the mile to Mrs. Henderson's small homestead, bringing a precious jar of preserved tomatoes from their garden. She returned to find Yancey kneeling beside the well, his expression grim. "What is it?" she asked, though she already knew. "It's failing," he said flatly. "Maybe a week's worth left if we're careful. 2 at most." Ruth sank down beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "What will we do?" Yancey stared into the depths of the well as if willing it to replenish itself. "I'll ride to San Antonio tomorrow, sell most of the remaining herd. Should be enough to get us through till the rains come." He looked at her then, his expression softening. "If you want to come along, I'd understand. More opportunities in the city." The us in his statement wasn't lost on Ruth, nor was the fact that he included her in his plans. "And leave all my hard work in the garden." She replied with forced lightness. "Not a chance, Mr. Thornton." That night, as Ruth lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the shutters, she confronted the truth she'd been avoiding. Somewhere along the way, this temporary arrangement had become something she couldn't bear to lose. The thought of Yancey riding away, potentially never returning if opportunities arose elsewhere, left her cold with dread. Morning came too quickly. Ruth rose before dawn to prepare food for Yancey's journey, her movements mechanical as she tried not to think of the days ahead without him. When he emerged from the barn, already dressed for travel, she handed him a bundle of provisions without meeting his eyes. "Should last you to San Antonio," she said briskly. "I've included the last of the cornbread." "Ruth," he said softly, causing her to finally look up. "I'll be back in a week." 10 days at most. She nodded, embarrassed by the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "Of course. Be careful on the road. There's been talk of desperados preying on travelers." Yancey reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek in a gesture so unexpected that Ruth forgot to breathe. "I've got plenty of reasons to return safely," he said, his voice rough with feeling. Then he was gone, the dust from his horse's hooves the only evidence he'd been there at all. Ruth stood watching until he disappeared over the ridge, then turned back to the cabin that suddenly seemed much larger and emptier than before. The first 2 days without Yancey passed slowly, as Ruth busied herself with chores, rationing water with even greater care now that their supply was dwindling. On the 3rd day, clouds gathered on the horizon, teasing with the possibility of rain only to disperse by nightfall without delivering a single drop. On the 4th day, a group of travelers appeared, a family of 5 whose wagon had broken down on the road to Bandera. Ruth shared what little food and water she could spare, helping the mother tend to a child suffering from heat exhaustion while the father repaired their wagon wheel. "You're alone here?" the woman asked as they worked. "Isn't that dangerous for a young woman, my?" Ruth hesitated, unsure how to describe Yancey. "The owner of the ranch has gone to San Antonio on business. He'll return soon." The woman gave her a knowing look, but said nothing more on the subject. When the family departed the next morning, the father pressed a silver dollar into Ruth's hand despite her protests. "For your kindness," he insisted. "May God bring rain to your land soon." By the 6th day, Ruth was growing worried. The well was nearly dry, and there was still no sign of Yancey. She began preparing to leave for Bandera, packing the few possessions she'd accumulated during her stay, though her heart rebelled at the thought of not being there when Yancey returned. That night, Ruth sat on the porch despite the heat, straining to see through the darkness for any sign of an approaching rider. The moon cast silver light across the parched landscape, creating shadows that her anxious mind repeatedly mistook for a man on horseback. Exhaustion eventually drove her inside, where she fell into a restless sleep plagued by dreams of endless drought and abandonment. She awoke to a sound that seemed at first to be part of her dream, a soft, persistent patter against the roof. Ruth lay still, disbelieving, until a flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by a rumble of thunder. Then she was on her feet, rushing outside in her nightgown, face turned upward to the miraculous sensation of raindrops on her skin. The rain began gently but quickly intensified into a downpour. Ruth stood in the yard, arms outstretched, laughing and crying simultaneously as water soaked through her clothing. The parched earth couldn't absorb the sudden deluge fast enough, creating rivulets that soon became small streams rushing toward lower ground. It was amidst this chaos of elemental relief that Yancey returned, his horse splashing through newly formed puddles as he approached the cabin. He dismounted quickly, concern evident in his expression as he spotted Ruth standing drenched in the middle of the yard. "Ruth," he called over the sound of the rain. "What are you doing? You'll catch your death." But when he reached her, Yancey saw the joy radiating from her face and understood. Without a word, he pulled her into an embrace, both of them laughing as the rain continued to fall around them. "You're late," Ruth said when they finally pulled apart, though she couldn't stop smiling. "Had to outride the storm," Yancey replied, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Sold almost everything, but managed to get a good price." He glanced upward. "Though I'm thinking we might not need the money as desperately now." They stood there, reluctant to move from this perfect moment, until another flash of lightning reminded them of the storm's intensity. "We should get inside," Yancey said, his hand still resting lightly on Ruth's shoulders. The touch, combined with the sudden awareness of her soaked nightgown clinging to her body, brought a flush to Ruth's cheeks that had nothing to do with the rain's cooling effect. Inside the cabin, Ruth changed into dry clothes while Yancey built a small fire in the stove to ward off the unusual chill the rain had brought. They sat close together, listening to the steady drumming on the roof, a sound so precious it seemed almost sacred. "I was afraid you might not come back," Ruth admitted, staring into the flames. Yancey turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I told you I would." "People say many things they don't mean," she replied softly. "I'm not people," he said simply, "and I don't say things I don't mean." He hesitated, then added, "Which is why I need to tell you something, Ruth." Her heart quickened at his tone. "What is it?" "In San Antonio, I was offered a job, foreman position on a big ranch near Austin. Good pay, housing included." He watched her face carefully as he spoke. "I turned it down." Ruth couldn't hide her surprise or her relief. "Why would you do that? It sounds like a fine opportunity." "Because it would have meant leaving this place," Yancey said. "Leaving you." The simple declaration hung between them, heavy with implications. "Yancey," Ruth began, uncertain what to say. "I don't want you sacrificing your future out of some sense of obligation toward me." "It's not obligation," he interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "Ruth, these past weeks, having you here." He ran a hand through his damp hair, struggling to find the right words. "I know it hasn't been long and maybe this is foolish, but I can't imagine going back to how things were before you." Ruth felt tears forming, different from those shed in the rain. "I've been afraid to admit the same thing," she whispered. "After Daniel, I swore I wouldn't let myself depend on anyone again. But then you found me, shared your water, your home. And now I'd like to share my life," Yancey finished for her, reaching for her hand. "If you'll have me." The rain continued through the night and into the next day, a blessed deluge that replenished the well and brought new life to the parched landscape. Ruth and Yancey spent those hours talking, planning, and discovering the depth of feelings that had grown between them during their shared struggle against the drought. "We should wait," Ruth said at one point, practical despite the joy bubbling within her. "Make sure this isn't just gratitude or relief making us rash." Yancey agreed, though the look in his eyes whenever they met hers suggested his mind was already made up. "The circuit preacher comes through Bandera first Sunday of every month," he noted casually. "That gives us a few weeks to be certain." Those weeks passed in a blur of renewal, not just of the land, which responded to the rain with almost miraculous speed, green shoots appearing where there had been only dust but of hope and possibility. Yancey used the money from the cattle sale to purchase new breeding stock, while Ruth expanded the garden, planting seeds she'd carefully preserved during the drought. They maintained a propriety that amused the neighboring ranchers and their wives who came to call once the roads were passable again. Yancey continued sleeping in the barn, despite Ruth's insistence that she could move there instead, his old-fashioned honor winning out over practicality. "People will talk," Ruth warned after the third visitor made pointed remarks about their living arrangement. "Let them," Yancey replied with a shrug. "We know the truth of things." The truth was that they were falling deeply in love, their connection forged in hardship and strengthened by shared purpose. Ruth found herself watching Yancey as he worked, admiring not just his physical strength but the quiet integrity that guided his every action. And Yancey discovered in Ruth a partner whose determination matched his own, whose presence transformed his solitary existence into something far richer. When the first Sunday of September arrived, they rode to Bandera together, Ruth wearing her best dress, a new one Yancey had purchased in San Antonio as a surprise, and Yancey in a clean shirt with his beard neatly trimmed. They sat through the preacher's sermon, both barely hearing the words as they waited for their moment. Afterward, as the congregation dispersed, they approached the preacher, a kind-faced man in his 60s who traveled throughout the region ministering to isolated communities. "Reverend Miller," Yancey began, his usual confidence suddenly diminished. "We were hoping you might, that is, Miss Vance and I, what Mr. Thornton is trying to say," Ruth interjected with a smile, "is that we would be honored if you would marry us. Today, if possible." The preacher looked between them, his expression warming. "Well now, that's a fine request. Known each other long, have you?" "Long enough to know what matters," Yancey replied, finding his voice again as his hand sought Ruth's. "We've weathered a drought together." "Figure that's trial enough for any couple." Reverend Miller chuckled. "Can't argue with that logic, son." He glanced at the small church behind them. "Give me half an hour to finish my business here, and I'll be happy to join you two in matrimony." Word spread quickly through the small town, and by the time the ceremony began, the church was filled with ranchers, shopkeepers, and families who'd come to witness the union. Mrs. Henderson insisted on lending Ruth a lace handkerchief for something borrowed, while the storekeeper's wife hastily arranged wildflowers into a small bouquet. Standing before the preacher, hands joined and hearts full, Ruth and Yancey exchanged simple vows that belied the profound journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you, Yancey Thomas Thornton, take Ruth Elizabeth Vance to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Yancey replied, his voice steady and sure. "With all that I am." "And do you, Ruth Elizabeth Vance, take Yancey Thomas Thornton to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Ruth looked up into Yancey's gray eyes, remembering the day he'd found her desperate beside a dried-up creek bed, offering water when it was the most precious commodity in the world. "I do," she said, "now and always." "Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher smiled warmly. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Thornton." Yancey's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a pledge of all the days to come. When they turned to face the gathered witnesses, the applause and cheers reflected the community's approval of this union born of hardship and hope. The small reception that followed at Bandera's only hotel was a testament to frontier hospitality. Everyone contributed something: a pie, a jug of cider, music from a fiddle played by the blacksmith. Yancey and Ruth danced in the center of the room, oblivious to the knowing smiles around them. "Mrs. Thornton," Yancey murmured against Ruth's ear as they swayed to the music, "has a nice sound to it." "It does indeed, Mr. Thornton," she replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Though I'm still getting used to the idea." "We have time," he said simply. "All the time in the world." They left the celebration as twilight descended, riding double on Yancey's horse toward home, their home now, truly shared. The land around them was beginning to recover from the drought, patches of green visible even in the fading light, a reminder that renewal always followed even the harshest desolation. At the cabin, Yancey lifted Ruth from the horse with reverent hands, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "I believe this is traditional," he said with a smile that made Ruth's pulse quicken. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the table, the bed was made with clean linens, and a bottle of wine, a rare luxury, waited beside two mismatched glasses. "When did you do all this?" Ruth asked, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Had some help from Mrs. Henderson yesterday," Yancey admitted. "Wanted our first night as husband and wife to be special." Ruth reached up to touch his face, wondering at the journey that had brought them together. "Every moment with you is special, Yancey Thornton." Later, as they lay together in the darkness, the intimacy of marriage new and wondrous between them, Ruth listened to the sound of Yancey's heartbeat beneath her cheek and felt a peace she'd thought forever lost to her. "What are you thinking?" Yancey asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she replied. "If not for the drought, we might never have found each other." Yancey's arm tightened around her. "Then I'm grateful for it, terrible as that sounds." "Not terrible," Ruth assured him, "just true." The years that followed brought both joy and challenge to the Thornton ranch. The rains returned in earnest that autumn, ending the drought but bringing flooding that damaged many homesteads in the region. Yancey and Ruth's land, situated on higher ground, largely escaped the worst effects, allowing them to help neighbors rebuild. By the following spring, Ruth discovered she was expecting their first child, news that transformed Yancey from a usually composed man into an endearingly anxious, expectant father. He insisted on hiring a young man from town to help with the heavier ranch work so Ruth could rest, though she maintained the garden and household until her advancing condition made such activity impractical. Their son, Samuel James Thornton, was born on a crisp November morning in 1874, with Mrs. Henderson serving as midwife. Yancey, who had faced cattle rustlers and Confederate cavalry with equal courage, found himself nearly undone by his wife's labor, pacing outside the cabin until the elderly neighbor ordered him to come hold Ruth's hand through the final stages. When he first held his son, Yancey's expression of wonder and love was something Ruth knew she would remember until her dying day. "He has your eyes," she said tiredly from the bed, watching her husband cradle their newborn with careful hands. "And your spirit, I'd wager," Yancey replied, sitting gently beside her. "Look at him, not even an hour old and already surveying his kingdom." The years flowed one into another as their family grew. A daughter, Margaret, joined them in 1876, followed by twins William and Joshua in 1878, a birth that nearly cost Ruth her life and left Yancey sleepless for days as she slowly recovered. Through it all, the connection that had formed during that desperate summer of drought only deepened. They worked side by side, building the ranch into a prosperous enterprise known throughout the county for its fine horses, a breeding program Ruth had suggested based on her childhood knowledge of horseflesh. Bandera grew as well, transforming from a frontier outpost into a proper town with a school, where the Thornton children received their education, supplemented by evenings spent reading from Yancey's ever-expanding library. Ruth insisted that their daughter learn alongside her brothers, preparing her for a world where women's opportunities were gradually expanding. She should have choices, Ruth told Yancey as they watched 12-year-old Margaret confidently solving mathematical problems that stumped her older brother. More than I had. She will, Yancey promised. They all will. In 1883, exactly 10 years after Yancey had found Ruth beside the dried-up creek, they hosted a celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered to mark not just their decade of marriage, but the community's survival through multiple challenges: drought, flood, economic hardship, and change. The original cabin, now expanded into a comfortable home, stood at the center of a thriving ranch. The garden Ruth had coaxed back to life during that first desperate summer had grown into a productive plot that supplied not only their family, but often provided surplus for neighbors in need. The windmill still turned, drawing water from the spring that had never again run dry. As twilight descended and lanterns were lit for dancing, Yancey found Ruth standing alone on the porch, watching their 4 children playing with the other youngsters. "Happy?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Ruth leaned into him, the gesture as natural as breathing after a decade together. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I am that you found me that day." "I think we found each other," Yancey corrected gently. "And I thank God for it every day." As they stood together watching the celebration unfold before them, Ruth reflected on the journey from that moment of desperate thirst to this abundance of life and love. The cowboy who had once shared his water had indeed shared his life, creating together a legacy neither could have imagined alone. In the years that followed, as their children grew and eventually started families of their own, Ruth and Yancey Thornton remained the heart of their community, a living testament to the power of kindness offered in a moment of need, and the enduring strength of love that blooms even in the harshest conditions. When another drought struck the region in 1896, the Thornton Ranch became a haven for struggling families, their well and wisdom freely shared with all who needed it. And when younger generations asked how they'd managed to build such a life together, Ruth would simply smile and begin the story the same way each time. It started with water, freely given when it was worth more than gold. By their 50th anniversary in 1923, celebrated with children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren gathered around them, the legend of Ruth and Yancey Thornton had become part of Bandera's history, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with grand gestures but with simple human kindness in the face of adversity. And though the Texas landscape would endure many more cycles of drought and plenty in the centuries to come, the spring beneath the Thornton Ranch never ran dry, a fitting metaphor, their descendants would say, for the love that had first taken root there during the Great Drought of 1873.